Everyone smelled the smoke, but only I knew what it meant. My cedar cabin, my retreat, my sanctuary, was nothing but blackened bones rising from the Minnesota snow. The air was still sharp with the sting of accelerant, bitter, and wrong. People whispered about electrical faults, about chance, about the cruelty of winter. But I knew better. I knew someone had planned this. Someone had waited for the night to be still, the neighbors asleep, and the fire trucks delayed. And as I stood in the frozen ruins, the ember glow still licking at the ashes, I could see her. Victoria Sterling Whitmore, standing in her kitchen, window across the cul-de-sac, a steaming mug of coffee in her hands. She wasn't mourning. She wasn't concerned. Her lips curled into the kind of smile you give after a job well done. Then, with the mockery of a toast, she lifted her cup to me before vanishing into the warmth of her perfect, untouchable home. The smell of charred cedar clung to my coat as I bent down, examining what was left. Most people in this neighborhood didn't know who I really was. To them, I was the quiet neighbor, the man who kept to himself, who built a cabin to write in. They didn't know the robes I wore when I wasn't home. They didn't know I had spent 18 years dissecting evidence, exposing criminal networks, and watching men like Victoria crumble in courtrooms when they thought they were untouchable. But I stayed silent. Let them underestimate me. It was easier that way. Now, as I sifted through the debris, I found what she hadn't expected. My security system had survived. The camera designed to withstand fire had rotated away from the blaze. Its LED blinked steadily, like a heartbeat in the darkness. Inside, it carried her mistake, proof. The footprints in the snow told more of the story. Size 7, sharp-heeled, expensive, arrogant. A faint trace of Chanel No. 5 still clung to the frozen air. And under a pine tree, I found the half-melted purple glove, the kind that could hold fingerprints, or worse, DNA. Neighbors would think this was random. Bad luck, but I knew better. Fires like this don't start themselves. Not at 2:20 a.m., not with accelerant poured so cleanly, not with fire crews delayed by nearly an hour. And who commanded that delay? Rick Morrison, the fire chief, and Victoria's older brother. Coincidence? No. It was the architecture of a conspiracy. The irony wasn't lost on me. Victoria thought she was teaching me a lesson, that the quiet artist would take his insurance check and vanish like so many others had before me. She thought my solitude was weakness, that silence meant submission. She didn't realize silence can also mean strategy. My phone buzzed, a message from Eleanor. Vasquez, the 77-year-old widow 4 houses down. I saw something last night. Can we talk privately? I looked up. The morning sun breaking through the smoke, shadows stretching long across the snow. Victoria believed she had erased the evidence, but she had left behind witnesses. Eleanor had been one of her targets before. A woman, Victoria. Tried to bully out of her home through harassment, strange accidents, code violations that never existed. Eleanor had resisted, and for that she had earned Victoria's attention. If she was reaching out now, it meant she had seen something worth more than smoke and ashes. I pulled my coat tighter, scanning the horizon. This wasn't about an insurance claim. It wasn't about a cabin. This was about justice. About the quiet dignity of standing against someone who believes power means they can do whatever they want. And Victoria was about to learn that her empire of fake citations and whispered threats was nothing against federal law. But I didn't move too quickly. Timing was everything. You don't win against predators by showing them your teeth too soon. You let them believe the prey is broken. You let them circle closer, confident, careless. 8 months earlier, when I first moved here, she had arrived on my doorstep with cookies and a smile rehearsed 1,000 times, a cream sweater, pearls, the charm of a realtor's dream. "Welcome to our perfect community," she had said. handing me warm cookies on china as if this neighborhood was hers to bestow. Even then, I had seen it, the hunger behind her eyes, the need not just to be liked but to control. And now, standing in the ruins of what she had done, I knew her need had become an empire built on intimidation and fire. But here's the truth. Sometimes the people you think are powerless are the ones who hold the most authority. Sometimes, the neighbor who doesn't show up at barbecues is the one with the final say in a federal courtroom. And sometimes the fire you light for someone else ends up consuming everything you thought you owned. So I stood there in the snow, ash coating, my boots, watching Victoria disappear behind her perfect curtains. And I promised myself one thing. She would pay. Not with smoke, not with fire, but with justice so complete it would strip every illusion of power she thought she had. The embers cooled behind me. The silence grew heavier, and for the first time since the fire began, I smiled. Because I knew this was only the beginning. Everyone else in the neighborhood slept soundly that night, but Eleanor didn't. Arthritis had kept her awake, aching joints forcing her out onto her back deck where she sat with a blanket and her old binoculars, staring at the stars. What she saw instead wasn't stars. It was shadows moving in and out of Victoria's garage. 6 figures, men and women she knew by face, if not by name. And among them, Victoria's brother, the fire chief, and Daniel Chase, the inspector whose reports had mysteriously ruined so many neighbors' lives. When Eleanor told me what she had seen, her voice trembled. Not with fear, she'd lived too long for that, but with the weight of knowing. "Judge Blackwood," she whispered. "They weren't playing cards. They had plans spread out on her table. Your cabin was one of them." She didn't need to convince me. I knew Victoria's smile had been too certain, her harassment too calculated, but hearing it aloud, hearing that there had been a meeting, that they had stood together and drawn the very map of my destruction, it hit differently. And then Eleanor added the part that made my blood run cold. Her grandson, Marcus, had hacked into Victoria's smart home system. 2 months earlier, just a curious experiment. He had guessed her password, default, never changed. And when she held these meetings in her garage, her Alexa device picked up everything, every word, every plan, every crime. That night, with Eleanor's permission, Marcus had turned the microphone into a window, and what came through wasn't neighborhood chatter, it was conspiracy. We listened together, the audio crisp in its betrayal. Victoria's voice was sharp, clinical. "The cabin is isolated. The wind patterns will keep the blaze contained. If we cut the main line, it will look electrical. We'll call it negligence." Rick Morrison chimed in with his role, a delayed emergency call. 40 minutes of silence while flames consumed everything. Daniel Chase promised his inspection report would cite wiring faults that didn't exist. Margaret and Sandra, board members, rehearsed lines they would post on social media about fire hazards and safety concerns, sowing the narrative before. Dawn even came. It wasn't just a scheme. It was a system. They had done this before. Peterson's shed, the Rodriguez garage, mysterious accidents that neighbors whispered about but never fought. Insurance claims that seemed to solve everything except the fact that families left shortly afterward, their homes sold to a shell company at cut-rate prices, Pineridge Development LLC, a name that sounded harmless until you traced the ownership back to Victoria's manicured hands. She had been using the HOA as a mask for organized crime. A casino project, Eleanor suspected. Land cleared through fear. And fire, properties collected like poker chips. And she thought my cabin would be just another casualty. But she had miscalculated. She believed I was a quiet man with too much free time and too little backbone. She hadn't considered what would happen when the person she targeted wasn't just a neighbor, but a federal judge with authority that stretched far beyond the cul-de-sac. The recording continued. Victoria's voice steady, almost rehearsed. The artist will take the payout and leave. These types don't fight. They can't. They don't understand real power. She laughed, and the others joined her. The sound made Eleanor grip her binoculars tighter, her knuckles white. Her words replayed in my mind as I walked back through the ruins of my cabin later that night. These types don't fight. She had no idea. My silence wasn't surrender. It was calculation. Every citation, every violation notice she had slipped into my mailbox, I had kept. Every offhand comment she made during her morning walks, I had recorded. She had been digging her own grave for 8 months, brick by brick, citation by citation. Now, with this recording, the foundation was complete. But still, I waited. A courtroom victory requires patience. Evidence must be layered, airtight, undeniable. I could not reveal myself yet, not as the judge she had unknowingly tried to crush. For now, I had to remain the quiet neighbor, the broken man who had lost his little retreat to bad luck. Let her laugh. Let her mock. Every word was another chain around her own neck. The next morning, I watched Victoria on her porch. She waved to passers-by, her face a portrait of concern. She even paused at Eleanor's mailbox, offering condolences, shaking her head in exaggerated sorrow at the tragedy that had happened to me. To anyone else, she looked like a neighbor full of sympathy. To me, she looked like a wolf in pearls, already circling her next kill. And yet, beneath her performance, I saw it, desperation. It was in the way she clutched her coffee cup too tightly, in the way her eyes darted to every car that passed, in the way her voice sometimes cracked during her rehearsed speeches at HOA meetings. She wasn't doing this just for control. She was doing it because she had to, because without control, she was nothing. That desperation made her dangerous, but it also made her reckless. That night, I filed my first report. Quietly, under federal seal. I reached out to a contact I trusted in the FBI, someone who knew how to handle organized crime and environmental violations. Maria Santos. I didn't. Tell her everything yet, just enough. The fire, the delay, the suspicious evidence, and the recording. She didn't hesitate. Judge, we'll move on this, but we need them to think they're safe. Don't break character. Don't let them know what you are. So I played the part. At the next HOA board meeting, I sat in the back row listening as Victoria lectured on community standards. She spoke of the fire, her voice heavy with practiced grief, blaming faulty wiring, urging inspections. And the board nodded. Neighbors patted me on the back, offering condolences. And all the while, my pocket recorder captured every word, every slip, every sigh. Victoria thought she was strengthening her grip on the neighborhood. But what she didn't know was that every move she made was now evidence. Every smile, every lie, every false sympathy, recorded, cataloged, preserved for the moment I would finally pull the mask away. And that moment was coming, faster than she realized. Everyone believed the fire was over, but the truth was, the real flames had just begun. When FBI agent Maria Santos stepped through my front door, she didn't come with sirens or spectacle. She came with silence. 2 other agents followed her, carrying equipment disguised as everyday fixtures, motion lights, electrical outlets, and even a birdhouse with more technology hidden inside than most police precincts owned. Maria was calm, focused, professional. Judge, we're going to make this invisible. She'll never know we're here, but we need you to keep playing your role. I nodded. It was harder than I expected. To sit across from Victoria at HOA meetings, to see her crocodile tears as she spoke about community tragedies, to hear neighbors praise her leadership, all while knowing the truth. She had burned my cabin with the precision of a military operation. She had orchestrated other fires before mine, and she was already planning the next. But if she thought my silence meant defeat, she was mistaken. Every nod I gave, every quiet smile, every word I let pass without challenge was another rope tightening around her empire. The FBI's team moved with military efficiency, cameras the size of coins, microphones thinner than sewing needles. They were everywhere now, in my yard, in the HOA's community center, in the mailbox clusters where Victoria liked to gossip during her morning walks. They even patched into Eleanor's grandson's digital feed from Victoria's Alexa, making what had once been a teenage experiment into federal surveillance evidence. What they uncovered was worse than I imagined. It started small. Victoria, coaching her board members on what to say about my fire. "Faulty wiring," she repeated again and again, drilling it like a script. But then the recordings revealed patterns stretching back months, years. Dozens of neighbors targeted, their lives made unbearable until they sold and fled. The same cycle every time: fraudulent citations, sudden accidents, delayed emergency responses, and then Victoria's shell company sweeping in to buy at a discount. The FBI began cross-referencing names, dates, insurance claims. A web emerged, its threads leading not just through Pine Ridge but across the state, other neighborhoods, other families. And at the center of it all, the woman who smiled at me over coffee mugs, who wore pearls and cashmere while plotting arson and fraud. But what broke me wasn't the scale. It was the arrogance. Because while she played the grieving president at board meetings, her private voice was cruel. One recording caught her laughing. The quiet artist finally got his lesson. Next time, maybe he won't resist. Another, spoken to her brother. They never fight back. They never have the resources. I remember pausing that recording, sitting in my office, my hands gripping the desk so tightly my knuckles turned white. She didn't know who I was. She didn't know the robes I wore. And yet, she had spoken those words with such certainty. It wasn't just arrogance. It was belief. She had built her life on the assumption that power always crushed the weak, that intimidation always won. But sometimes silence is strategy. Sometimes patience is power. At the next HOA meeting, I kept my head low. Neighbors whispered condolences. Victoria put on her performance, speaking about new safety inspections and protecting property values. Every word was captured by the microphone hidden in my pen. When she leaned in to whisper to Margaret, thinking no one could hear, the wire caught it perfectly. "Some neighbors need to learn the hard way. He got what was coming." Maria smiled when she played that back for me later. That's intent. That's your smoking gun. But the FBI didn't want just her. They wanted the network. They wanted every official she had bribed, every inspector she had bought, every firefighter she had silenced. So the game had to continue. It was a strange double life. By day, I was the quiet man who nodded politely while his neighbors gossiped. By night, I was reviewing surveillance transcripts, helping draft warrants, preparing evidence chains so tight they would hold even in the most ruthless courtroom. And through it all, Victoria kept circling, convinced she was winning. Her arrogance blinded her. She started posting on social media, subtle barbs disguised as concern. "Unusual dry winds tonight, everyone. Please check your wiring." The FBI matched the timestamp, 7 minutes before my cabin fire began. She was writing her own confession with every keystroke. Worse still, she couldn't resist talking about money. One recording captured Daniel Chase complaining about a late payment. "Don't worry," Victoria reassured him. "The next acquisition, we'll cover it. We'll have the land cleared before spring." The next acquisition, another target, another family who would lose everything if we didn't act, and so the surveillance deepened. Cell towers gave us her movements. Bank records gave us her bribes. Her own diary, discovered in a safe, gave us her motive. In ink, she had written, "Control is the only guarantee of survival. If you own every variable, nothing can touch you." But She was wrong. She didn't own every variable. She didn't own me. The hardest part was pretending. To sit at HOA gatherings while she laid out fake citations, to hear her blame wildlife disturbances on my solar panels, to hear her call me that artist who doesn't understand real responsibility. I had to bite my tongue, had to let her dig deeper. Every insult was another stone in the wall she was building around herself. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do isn't to fight back immediately, it's to wait. To let arrogance overreach, to let corruption grow too bold. Because the higher they build their tower, the harder it falls. 3 weeks after the fire, Victoria called an emergency HOA meeting. The agenda was vague. Community safety. Her voice trembled with that familiar edge of desperation. And as I walked into the community center, past neighbors whispering in confusion, I realized something. She was planning her final move. Her nuclear option. She didn't know it yet, but as she prepared her slideshow of lies, as she forged legal documents and printed fake county seals, the FBI was already moving. Raids were being planned, warrants were ready, and every second she believed herself untouchable was one more nail in her coffin. The embers of my cabin had cooled, but the fire she had started was only just beginning to spread, and this time, it would consume her. Everyone could feel it the moment they stepped into the community center that Thursday evening. The air wasn't the same. It carried weight, tension, something invisible pressed against everyone's chest, though no one could say why. Victoria had called the meeting with less than 24 hours' notice. No agenda, no details. Just a single vague phrase, community safety concerns. Residents arrived confused, whispering questions in the hallways. And at the front of the room, she stood ready, dressed like she was walking into court. Navy blazer, pearls shining under the fluorescent lights, posture stiff with authority. I slipped quietly into the back row, a notebook in my lap, a pen clipped to my pocket. My role was still the same. The quiet, broken man who had lost his little cabin to bad luck. But beneath the stillness, every breath I took carried the knowledge of what was happening beyond these walls. FBI vans staged quietly in parking lots, agents slipping into county offices, warrants being executed at the firehouse, the inspectors, desk, and Victoria's own pristine home. She didn't know it yet. And that made this moment electric. The projector flickered to life, bathing the room in pale blue light. Her first slide appeared, a photo of my burned cabin, skeletal beams reaching into gray smoke. Across the top, bold red letters. Protecting our investment. She spoke with perfect drama, her voice rehearsed, her pauses placed with surgical precision. Our community has faced a terrible tragedy. A fire that could have destroyed more than one home. A fire that endangered property values. Across Pine Ridge, murmurs spread across the room. Some neighbors glanced back at me, their expressions sympathetic. Others frowned, uncertain why she was framing my loss as a threat to their wallets. Victoria clicked to the next slide. Charts, graphs. Property values have declined 12% in neighborhoods with fire incidents, she announced, her tone solemn. We cannot allow this kind of risk to endanger our families, our futures. I watched her hands. They didn't tremble. Not yet. This was the woman at her best, when she believed she owned the stage. But arrogance always has cracks, and I knew hers were about to widen, because this presentation wasn't just theater, it was her attempt at the impossible, legalizing theft. She held up papers stamped with forged seals, brandishing them like scripture. Under Section 15.7 of the Pine Ridge HOA Charter, she declared, we are authorized to acquire unsafe properties through emergency eminent domain. This will protect all residents and ensure safety moving forward. Gasps filled the room. Some neighbors nodded, frightened. Others whispered, confused. There was no Section 15.7, no clause, no eminent domain in an HOA charter, but most of them didn't know that, and Victoria was counting on ignorance to carry the vote. And as she built her fantasy law, as she cited fake engineers and read testimony scripted by her board members, the FBI was moving through her world like fire through dry timber. Across town, agents stormed into her basement, discovering the war room she thought no one would ever see, maps pinned with colored markers, files thick with family secrets, financial ledgers documenting every bribe. At the fire station, her brother Rick tried to burn records, only to be caught with gasoline-stained hands and $85,000 in cash stuffed into a go-bag. At the county office, Daniel Chase fumbled with his computer, deleting inspection files seconds before agents stepped through the door. And yet here, in this small room, Victoria kept performing. I could see her confidence as she clicked to another slide. Fabricated statistics, insurance claims that never existed, fake expert reports. Her voice swelled with righteous conviction. Some residents think they can ignore standards, but ignoring standards endangers us all. We must vote tonight. We must take action. Her words rippled through the crowd, but not like before. This time, something was different. Whispers had begun. Phones buzzed with texts. People glanced at their screens, at each other, at her. The first murmurs reached me from the row ahead. The FBI's here? At Rick's office? Another whisper. I heard they're raiding Victoria's house right now. The cracks began to show. She saw it too. Her eyes darted toward the crowd, catching the glow of cell phones, the shifting expressions. She pressed on, forcing her voice to stay calm. But her hand twitched as she flipped the next slide. Eleanor stood then, her cane tapping against the floor as she rose. Her voice was steady but carried iron. Victoria, where exactly did you find this so-called eminent domain? Clause, because I've read that charter cover to cover, and it doesn't exist. The room erupted in murmurs. Heads turned. Doubts spread like wildfire. Victoria smiled, tight and brittle. Mrs. Vasquez, perhaps your memory isn't what it used to be. But she didn't finish. The double doors at the back of the community center swung open, and Rick Morrison, red-faced and sweating, rushed inside. He didn't speak to anyone, didn't sit down. He didn't even look at his sister. He just grabbed his coat from the rack and bolted toward the exit. Two men were waiting for him in the parking lot. They weren't neighbors. They were FBI agents. The arrest was swift, silent, undeniable. Dozens of residents pressed against the windows, watching as Rick was shoved against a car hood, handcuffs snapping around his wrists. The sight stole the oxygen from the room. Victoria froze at the podium. For the first time all evening, her mask slipped. Her lips parted, her face pale. The projector hummed behind her, casting the image of my burned cabin across her shoulder like a ghost she couldn't shake. I sat in the back row, still, silent, watching her empire crumble. She straightened quickly, forcing composure, her voice suddenly sharp. Emergency responders get urgent calls all the time. This proves nothing. She shuffled her fake documents, trying to regain the stage, but it was already too late. Half the residents were on their phones now, whispering about raids, about agents in bulletproof vests. The emergency vote she had orchestrated dissolved into chaos. Neighbors streamed out to check on their homes, leaving her with a shrinking audience. The few who stayed behind exchanged wary glances, doubt etched across their faces. The performance was over. She gathered her papers, stuffed them into her briefcase, and walked toward her Mercedes with her head held high. But I saw her hand tremble as she fumbled with the keys. I saw the thin crack in her armor. The woman who believed she controlled every variable was realizing, slowly, painfully, that there were forces she had never accounted for. And this was only the beginning of her fall. Everyone heard the echo of her heels before they saw her face. The federal courthouse in Minneapolis has a way of humbling people, but not Victoria Sterling Whitmore. Not that morning. Her Louis Vuitton pumps clicked against the marble floors, like a metronome of arrogance. She wore a navy Armani suit, a cream silk blouse, hair pinned in a perfect chignon. She looked every bit the polished professional, confident in her performance. Beside her strode her attorney, Martin Kellner, a local lawyer who had made a name defending HOAs in zoning disputes and municipal spats. To him, this was routine, a civil matter, a nuisance case. Nothing more. And Victoria believed it. She carried her Hermes briefcase like a trophy, convinced that her forged documents and rehearsed lines would protect her one more time. She believed she was untouchable because her whole life had reinforced that belief. Neighbors folded, officials bent, inspectors obeyed. Why would this courtroom be any different? She pushed through the double doors, ready to fight a man she still thought was nothing but a stubborn artist. And then she froze. For the first time in her life, her confidence faltered. Her eyes landed on the elevated bench, on the black robe, on the nameplate that read, "The Honorable Samuel J. Blackwood, United States District Judge." The room went still. She didn't move, didn't breathe. The color drained from her face, burgundy lipstick cracking as she pressed her lips together, in a desperate attempt to hide the tremble. She had burned the cabin of a federal judge. She had conspired against someone who didn't just understand the law, but embodied it. Her knees buckled slightly. She clutched her briefcase tighter as if the leather could shield her from what she now saw. The artist was no artist. The quiet man was no victim. He was the storm she had never prepared for. Her attorney cleared his throat, unaware of the gravity of the moment. "Your Honor, we're here for the preliminary hearing in Blackwood versus Pine Ridge Estates Homeowners Association." His voice carried the easy rhythm of a man who had argued zoning laws 100 times. He had no idea the ground beneath him was already caving in. I let the silence hang a beat longer than necessary. The weight of it filled the room, pressing down on Victoria until her hand visibly shook. Then I spoke. "Mr. Kellner," I said, my voice carrying the authority honed over 18 years of federal trials. "There has been some confusion about the nature of these proceedings. Mrs. Whitmore is not here as a defendant in a civil insurance dispute. She is here as the primary defendant in a federal criminal prosecution." Gasps rippled across the room. Martin Kellner blinked, his face draining of color. I beg your pardon?" The prosecutor rose from the government's table. Jennifer Walsh, sharp, relentless, carrying binders stacked nearly 2 feet high. "Your Honor, the United States is prepared to present evidence of racketeering, arson, mail fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and violations of federal environmental protection statutes." Victoria's eyes darted wildly, her mask crumbling piece by piece. "No," she whispered, too softly for most to hear, but loud enough for me to catch it. "No, this isn't possible. I didn't know." But it was possible. It was real. And it was all because she had underestimated the neighbor she thought she could intimidate with citations and flames. The evidence presentation began, and with every exhibit, her world collapsed further. Prosecutor Walsh started with the simplest. GPS data from Victoria's Fitbit, showing her exact movements the night of the fire. Her heart rate spiking from 72 to 156 beats per minute during the 20 minutes she carried accelerant and set my cabin ablaze. The numbers were displayed on a giant screen for everyone in the courtroom to see. Cold, precise, unforgiving. Then came the recordings. Victoria's voice filled the courtroom speakers, her tone clinical as she described how wind patterns would contain the fire. Another clip captured her laugh, dismissing me as the quiet artist who doesn't fight back. Every word she had thought was private now echoed through federal walls. She covered her face with her hands, but there was no hiding. Social media posts followed. At 2:10 a.m., 7 minutes before the fire, she had written, "Extreme fire danger. Tonight. Unusual dry winds." Her attempt at creating an alibi was destroyed by National Weather Service data showing high humidity and calm skies. The lie laid bare for all to see, and then the financials. $340,000 in irregular cash deposits, traced to her accounts. Payments to inspectors, bribes to fire officials. Ledgers in her own handwriting, discovered in the safe beneath her basement staircase, spelling out every transaction, every bribe, every manipulated life. But the final blow wasn't data. It wasn't numbers. It was her own words, her diary entries, read aloud by Prosecutor Walsh. Control is the only guarantee of survival. If you own every variable, nothing can touch you. Failure comes only from trusting others. The courtroom was silent as those words echoed. They revealed not just her crimes, but the hunger that had driven her, the desperation to control every inch of her world, because once, long ago, she had lost everything. I watched her break. Her breathing quickened. Tears smeared her makeup into streaks. Her perfect armor of silk and pearls dissolved in front of 100 strangers. When Prosecutor Walsh laid out the sentencing exposure, the reality finally landed. 47 years maximum. Mandatory minimums guaranteeing at least 15, millions in fines, asset forfeiture, even her house, her trust, funds, her retirement accounts. Gone. She whispered it again, this time audible to the room. I didn't know you were a judge. I thought... She trailed off, choking on the words. I thought you were just some artist. The arrogance that had fueled her for years collapsed into sobs. But those tears weren't for her victims. They weren't for the families she had harassed, the neighbors she had burned, the lives she had ruined. They were for herself. For the first time in her life, Victoria Sterling Whitmore couldn't script the ending. She couldn't control the outcome, and the realization tore her apart in front of everyone. The gavel struck, the hearing ended, and as marshals approached to escort her out, the woman who had raised a coffee mug to me over my burning cabin could barely stand. The fire she had lit had finally consumed her. Everyone remembers the sound. Not the words, not the gavel, not even the prosecutor's voice cataloging years of crimes. What people remember is the click, the sound of steel handcuffs snapping shut around Victoria Sterling Whitmore's wrists on the courthouse steps. She didn't go quietly. She tried to straighten her shoulders to walk with her head held high, but the sobs broke through. Mascara streaked down her cheeks. Her perfect silk blouse clung to her as the wind caught her. And for the first time in her life, there were no cameras under her control, no podium where she dictated the narrative. Only the unforgiving eye of news crews who had gathered outside, tipped off by whispers of something bigger than a civil HOA squabble. 4 FBI agents moved with military precision, forming a diamond around her. Maria Santos read the Miranda rights, slowly, clearly, each word slicing through the illusion of control Victoria had built her life on. You have the right to remain silent. And she did. For once in her life, Victoria had no words. The footage spread faster than anyone could have predicted. Within hours, the arrest video was viral. Her cabin justice flooded social media feeds across the country. People from neighborhoods thousands of miles away, people who had never heard of Pine Ridge, were suddenly telling their own HOA horror stories, attaching them to the clip of Victoria's breakdown. Neighbors, who once whispered in fear, now watched the video on loop, a kind of catharsis filling them with something they hadn't felt in years: hope. Because when one bully falls, every victim feels a little taller. Inside Pine Ridge, the atmosphere shifted overnight. The house on Birchwood Drive that had once been Victoria's fortress was suddenly empty. FBI tape stretched across the doors. The blinds that had always been perfectly aligned were crooked, left behind in haste. For the first time, her kitchen window was dark, and the neighborhood, her kingdom, was free to breathe. Eleanor was the first to step forward. At 77, she had lived through wars, through grief, through decades of quiet endurance. And now, cane in hand, she walked to the community center where Victoria had once ruled and called an impromptu gathering. 43 homeowners showed up that night. No PowerPoints, no fabricated data, no citations waved in the air like threats. Just neighbors sitting in folding chairs speaking to each other without fear. Eleanor cleared her throat. Every citation she gave us, every fine she filed, gone, permanently voided. We're starting over. The sigh that moved through the room wasn't just relief. It was release. Years of tension, of walking on eggshells, of wondering if their mailbox paint or grass height or porch lights would spark the next battle. All of it, gone in a single moment. One by one, residents spoke. Stories poured out. How Victoria had pressured them to sell, how sudden accidents had ruined their property, how the fear of fines had silenced them. The collective realization was staggering. They hadn't been bad neighbors. They hadn't been careless. They had been victims of a scheme designed to break them, and now, for the first time, they had power again. The vote was unanimous. Eleanor would serve as interim president until new elections could be held. Her first act wasn't to add rules, it was to burn them, literally. 60 pages of bylaws, micromanaging every inch of life, were tossed into a metal bin outside the center. Flames devoured them, sparks rising into the night. Children laughed as the papers curled and blackened, the same way Victoria had once laughed while plotting their neighbor's destruction. But this fire wasn't tragedy. It was rebirth. By the time the last page turned to ash, Pine Ridge felt different. And me? I watched it all from the back of the room, a quiet observer as always. But this time my silence wasn't strategy, it was satisfaction. To see a community once poisoned by control begin to taste freedom. It was justice beyond the courtroom. The FBI continued their work, unraveling every thread of Victoria's empire. Bank accounts seized, properties reclaimed, officials indicted. The scale of it stunned even me. She hadn't just manipulated one neighborhood, she had been part of a multi-state scheme, a coordinator in an organized crime syndicate using HOAs as their camouflage. But what struck me most wasn't her fall. It was the resilience of the people she had tried to break. Within weeks, Pine Ridge began to heal. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in years gathered to repaint fences, to share meals, to rebuild what had been lost. My own cabin, once reduced to ashes, became a project not just for me, but for all of them. Volunteers offered their hands. Some brought lumber, others brought food. Marcus Vasquez, Eleanor's grandson, designed a solar system to power the cabin, turning what was once a target into a beacon of resilience. I would rebuild, but I wouldn't rebuild alone. Sometimes justice looks like a gavel. Sometimes it looks like handcuffs. But sometimes it looks like neighbors finally daring to laugh in their own yards again. And as the snow began to melt, revealing green shoots of spring across blackened earth, Pine Ridge discovered something more powerful than control: community. Victoria thought she had burned my cabin to the ground. She thought she had destroyed me. But what she really destroyed was her own illusion of power. And from those ashes, something stronger was rising. But her story wasn't finished yet. Because while Pine Ridge began to heal, the broader world was just waking up to the scale of her crimes. And the fire she started here was about to spread far beyond one neighborhood. Everyone thought the story ended with the handcuffs. But the truth is that was only the beginning. Because when one empire falls, it leaves behind a blueprint. one that others can follow, one that prosecutors can weaponize, one that ordinary people can use to fight back. And that's exactly what happened. Within weeks of Victoria's arrest, the Department of Justice made their move. My case file wasn't just evidence against a corrupt HOA president. It was precedent. A federal judge targeted in his own neighborhood, evidence of arson, racketeering, bribery, environmental crimes. It was the perfect storm, and they knew it. Federal prosecutors in Washington began drafting a strategy using Pine Ridge as the test case for something bigger, dismantling organized crime disguised as homeowners associations. For decades, families across the country had whispered about HOA abuse, harassment, intimidation, impossible fines. But it had always been seen as local, civil, small. Victoria changed that. Her arrogance had connected the dots. Her obsession with control had created the perfect example of how these neighborhood associations could become criminal enterprises. And now, she was going to be the face of a national reckoning. News anchors called her the HOA Queenpin. Late-night hosts mocked her mugshot, comparing her to mob bosses. But beneath the laughter, there was a deeper current, a wave of stories flooding in from every state. Families ruined, homes stolen, retirements drained, ordinary people standing up and saying, "This isn't just a nuisance, this is tyranny, the A." DOJ listened. Indictments rolled out like dominoes, 47 more across 12 states in less than 8 months. Networks of fake citations, bribed inspectors, delayed fire responses, each one unraveling because Victoria had been reckless enough to burn down the wrong cabin, and Pine Ridge became the symbol. Reporters flocked to our cul-de-sac, cameras capturing, neighbors laughing together in front of the community garden that had replaced Victoria's seized property. Children played where her empire had once stood. Journalists framed it as rebirth, resilience, a neighborhood liberated from its own dictator. But the attention came with something else. Opportunity. Producers from HBO arrived, contracts in hand. A limited series, they said. The Cabin Judge. They wanted to film on location, to capture the real houses, the real snow, the real faces of neighbors who had lived through it. Not actors. Real people. Eleanor smiled at the thought, her cane, her stubbornness, her refusal to bow to tyranny. She would become a character in a story bigger than herself. I agreed to consult. Accuracy mattered. The law had to be shown as it truly was, not glamorous, not easy, but steady, patient, inevitable. Because if one person somewhere, watching, late at night, learned that they could fight back against their own HOA bullies, then maybe the pain of losing my cabin wasn't wasted. At the same time, I began writing. Not court opinions, not legal briefs. A book. HOA Hell, a federal judge's guide to fighting neighborhood tyranny. I didn't write it as a victim. I wrote it as a map. For every homeowner who had ever felt small, who had ever stared at a stack of violation letters and wondered if they were powerless. Practical strategies, sample documents, evidence collection methods, and most importantly, the reminder that they weren't alone. The book hit shelves and, to my shock, became a bestseller within weeks. Not because of me, but because people were hungry. Hungry for tools, hungry for justice, hungry to believe that they could fight back. Meanwhile, the halls of Congress stirred. The House Judiciary Committee summoned me to testify. The story of Pine Ridge had made it impossible to ignore the need for federal oversight. I sat beneath the bright lights of Capitol Hill, the microphones catching every word as I explained how local corruption thrived because it was treated as too small for federal eyes. How mail fraud, wire fraud, and environmental crimes were not small at all, but weapons used by HOA tyrants across the country. I recommended something new. The Federal Community Association Accountability Act. A law that would bring transparency, mandatory audits, and federal jurisdiction over large HOAs. And for once, Congress listened. Because when people watched Victoria cry in handcuffs on live TV, the abstract became real. Everyone knew a Victoria, and everyone wanted her gone. But as national as the story became, Pine Ridge itself was changing in quieter, more powerful ways. The garden bloomed where her house had once stood. Sunflowers rose from soil that had once been poisoned by fear. Marcus Vasquez's solar design didn't just power my cabin, it powered the entire community center, giving the neighborhood energy independence Victoria could never have imagined. The bylaws, once 60 suffocating pages, had been reduced to 12, crafted collaboratively by residents instead of dictated by a single tyrant. And Eleanor, dear, resilient Eleanor, thrived. At 77, she became a leader she never knew she could be. She didn't rule. She listened. She asked. She built consensus. And in that listening, in that patience, she achieved more for property values and community spirit than Victoria's iron fist ever had. Sometimes dignity doesn't come from domination. Sometimes it comes from cooperation. One evening, months after the arrest, I stood on the porch of my half-rebuilt cabin. The air smelled of fresh pine, of sawdust and soil. Across the garden, children laughed, neighbors waved, and I realized something. Victoria had thought she was erasing me. She thought she was teaching me fear. But in burning my cabin, she had lit something else, something much larger. She had lit a movement, and that movement was only just beginning. Everyone waited for the sentencing. Months had passed since the arrest, months since the hearings and the indictments, but the anticipation never faded. People wanted closure. They wanted to see the woman who had burned a cabin, bribed officials, and terrorized a neighborhood finally face the only power she could never bend. The federal courtroom was packed that morning. Journalists lined the benches, cameras crowded the sidewalk outside. Neighbors from Pine Ridge filled the gallery, their presence quiet but resolute. Eleanor sat in the second row, her cane propped against the pew, eyes sharp as flint. Marcus sat beside her, arms crossed, protective, and then they brought her in, Victoria Sterling Whitmore. But not the woman we once knew, not the polished queenpin, not the woman in pearls and Armani suits. What walked through those doors was a shell. She wore the orange of a federal inmate. Her hair, once perfectly coiffed, hung dull against her shoulders. She shuffled rather than strutted. Shackles clinked with each step, and her hands trembled as she clutched a folded piece of paper. Her statement. When she turned and saw the gallery, she froze, because every face staring back at her was one she had once controlled. Every neighbor she had fined, every elder she had mocked, every family she had broken. And now, not one of them looked away. The judge presiding wasn't me. By law, I recused myself. Instead, it was Judge Harmon, a man known for his steady demeanor and unflinching sense of justice. He began with the charges, one by one: racketeering, arson, mail fraud, wire fraud, obstruction of justice, conspiracy. Each word carried weight. Each count another brick in the wall closing in on her. Then came the victim's statements. Eleanor rose, her voice soft but unshaking. You thought you could silence us. You thought fear would control us. But fear is not forever. You burned one cabin, but you ignited something you could never contain. Her words landed like stones, and Victoria's tears fell unchecked. Then, Marcus. Then the young mother who had once been fined for her child's toys left on the lawn. Then the retired teacher who had been threatened over a broken fence. Each voice, a chorus of pain, but also of survival. When it was her turn, Victoria unfolded her paper. Her hands shook so violently that the sheet rattled. She tried to read, but her voice cracked. I never meant, I only wanted. The words trailed off. She couldn't finish. She dropped the paper and wept into her shackled hands. Judge Harmon allowed the silence to stretch before speaking. Mrs. Whitmore, you built your life on control. You believed power made you safe. But, in your desperation to dominate others, you destroyed yourself. This court sentences you to 27 years in federal prison, restitution in the amount of $12 million, and forfeiture of all assets acquired through fraud. The gavel struck. Final, unshakable. The sound echoed through the courtroom, through the cameras, through the country. The woman who once raised a mug in triumph as my cabin burned, now lowered her head in chains, her empire gone. But here's the twist no one expected. In the months that followed, as her files were combed through, investigators realized something extraordinary. Her obsession with control, her meticulous ledgers, her hoarded documents, they became the roadmap for dismantling every network like hers. She had left behind blueprints so detailed, so obsessive, that prosecutors across the country used them as guides. Her downfall wasn't just her own. It became the undoing of dozens more like her. The very thing she believed would make her invincible, control, was the thing that ensured her destruction. And Pine Ridge? It thrived. My cabin rose again from the ashes, rebuilt not just by my hands, but by dozens of others. The smell of cedar returned to the valley, and this time, laughter filled the porch before the walls were even finished. Where there had once been silence and smoke, there was now music, conversation, the clatter of shared meals. The neighborhood, once ruled by fear, became a symbol of freedom. Not perfect, not flawless, but alive in a way it hadn't been in years. And me? I stood on the porch one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky with gold and crimson, and I thought about her, about Victoria, about the moment she had looked at me across the flames and thought she had won. And I realized something. Sometimes, justice doesn't come in the form of vengeance. Sometimes it comes in the form of truth revealed, a truth so bright, so undeniable, that no amount of control can hide it. Victoria tried to erase me, but in the end, she erased herself, and from her ashes, we built something stronger. So if you take one thing from this story, let it be this. Bullies build their empires on silence, but the moment you speak, the moment you refuse to bow, the cracks begin to show. That's all it takes. One voice, one refusal, one spark of courage, and sometimes that's enough to burn an empire down. You've heard this confession. Now wait until you hear the next one.